Claude Debussy was one of the most influential composers of the late 19th and early 20th centuries. He combined modernism and sensuality into works of sheer beauty that broke new boundaries in classical music.
Welcome to episode number 4 of Musical Footprints, the stories behind the greatest composers of classical music.
I'm Paul Geldrop in Eindhoven, the Netherlands.
And I'm Steve Moretti in Ottawa, Canada. So it's great to be back at it, Paul. It's snowing in Ottawa. I'm watching it fall lightly from the sky. It's very beautiful. It's that time of year, I guess. And what's new with you across in the Netherlands?
Well, not much. I've just been busy with work. We don't have snow yet, but I don't think it's going to take very long. We've got a lot of fog. I think I can see about 100 meters outside the window, and that's it.
Nice.
So it's cold. It's winter, which is fine. We got the holidays coming up, and I love just staying indoors and avoiding the cold weather, and if possible, all the social activities as well.
Yeah, it's good for writing and making music too.
It is. Yeah, it's the best time.
Yeah, I've been madly editing the audiobook versions of Song for a Lost Kingdom, Book 1 and 2, which you did the music for. And I have to say, in my totally unbiased opinion, it sounds amazing.
that is your objective.
Yeah, exactly. We had two actors, Tom McLean from Glasgow and Bethany Mason from Montana, USA, come in. And we recorded all of Book 2 in the studio, and we're now mixing it. And going back to mixing Book 1 as well with your music in both of them, and it's just coming together very nicely, and I'm really excited to share it with people very soon.
So, Steve, this time we picked a very interesting character, Claude Debussy, and before we get into his music and his life, I just want to give people a short, a quick idea of what makes Debussy so special. His work is very often described as impressionistic, and that was a term that he absolutely hated himself because it suggested a certain lack of structure, and it suggested a certain vagueness to his work, which he definitely found wasn't there. So that is not a term that he enjoyed very much, but it has to be said that the sort of music that he wrote was very different from what people were used to in those days, and we're going to hear plenty of examples about that. But before we do that, I think it's a good idea to have a little idea of how his life went.
Yes, well, we've been to Italy, and we've been to Norway, and now we're in France. And Debussy was born just outside of Paris in 1862, and his full name is Achille Claude. I call him Claude Debussy. His family was not doing too well, very impoverished. His father tried to make money. His father's name was Manuel. He had a china shop. He was a traveling salesman at one point, worked in a print shop. Nothing really worked. His mother, Victorine, was a seamstress. And about this time, things were kind of really upended in France. There were 60 different governments that came and went over the course of just a few years. And at one point, there was the Paris Commune, which is a bunch of radical types, socialists and things. And they actually took over Paris only for a few months in 1871. And then the army moved in, and Claude's father was arrested and put in jail. And at this point, things were not going too good for him. He was, I think, probably 5, 6, 7 years old. And he went to live with his dad's sister. And his mother wanted to try to get him back, and she was always, sort of making visits, but not able to see him. And so he just ended up getting bounced around. But one good thing that did happen was when his father was in prison, he met a guy named Charles de Sivry and mentioned that he had a son, Claude, who seemed to be very interested in music, and he'd already started to play the piano. And it turned out that this guy's mother, Antoinette Moretti, was a pianist, and she happened to have studied with Chopin. And so one thing led to another, and Claude was able to get into the Paris Conservatory when he was only 10. And that was, I think, really changed the course of his life for the better. And if that set of circumstances hadn't happened, it could be we wouldn't really be doing the show right now, and no one would have ever heard of Claude Debussy. So at the Paris Conservatory, basically, Claude grew up there. He was there for 11 years. And if you can imagine this, from the age of 10 to 21. Now, he had many adventures along the way, but he studied as a very prestigious conservatory. And at first, people thought he was kind of a really charming little kid, but he had always had this little bit of artistic temperament. Others just thought he was kind of sketchy and a bit cavalier. And so his typical day, he would study piano and solfège. And Paul, can you just describe what that means, the solfège?
Yeah, so solfège is where you basically work on your musical hearing. And that includes singing notes. It also includes listening to someone sing a certain melody and transcribe that to sheet music. It's some people find it fun. I really didn't like it.
Well, Claude was actually very good at it. And he said he could have actually made a career just out of that, out of sight reading. But anyways, so he was good at that. He also had classes in composition, harmony, music history, and music theory. The only thing is he didn't go to very many of his classes, apparently. So I think he probably liked the composition, but a lot of them he just skipped. And his teacher said he was very careless and he was only intermittently diligent. But the one thing is he was a very good pianist. And I guess that was pretty obvious. And he was an outstanding sight reader. And in this conservatory, they were constantly having competitions. And if you didn't win them or do very well, you actually wouldn't be able to go to some of the classes. And eventually he got booted out of the composition classes, which is probably the one class he should have been in. But that was just the way things were structured there. So anyways, that's a brief recap of his formative years, I guess, growing up at the conservatory.
Yeah, it's actually quite funny that you mentioned that about the compositional courses because I knew that he was a very bad student and he was a great pianist and he could have had a wonderful career as a pianist, but he was, as far as I could tell, a terrible student. He missed a lot of classes. He also missed a lot of classes on composition because he was confronted there with the fundamentals of harmony, counterpoint, musical form. So when you go to a conservatory like that, you are taught to compose, to write, and to analyze according to the structures and theory of what we call the common practice period, which is about 300 years of musical history. We often know it as the classical period, though that's only one part of it. But Claude didn't really like any of those fundamentals. He sort of defied them, and that also defines his style later on as a composer. He did a lot of things in his works that went straight against every fundamental rule that you are taught in harmony. A few things that some of the more musically inclined may be familiar with is, for example, using parallel fifths, which is something you are absolutely forbidden to do in that sort of theory. He did that a lot. When you're writing a piece and you have a leading tone, you always have to resolve it to the tonic. Claude refused to do that. So he sort of, he knew that was something that he had to learn. He was, that they told him that he had to learn that, but he kind of refused. So that also explains why he decided to skip a lot of those classes, because the music that he wrote and the way he wanted to write was contrary to everything he was being taught at those lessons. So I can imagine that he was a bad student because he just thought, why am I learning this? I don't want to use this. I don't care. I have my own style, and that's the way that I write. And I'm not going to do it like they tell me to. So I would say a pretty annoying student.
Yeah. Although sometimes they say you have to learn all the rules before you break them. But in his case, I think he learned some of them and he broke all of them. So yeah, interesting.
Well, he also just refused to do anything with some of the rules that he was taught. One of the things that is very typical of the Debussy style, and also becomes a lot more prominent later after his death, was something that is called bitonality or the polytonality. And tonality in music means that when you, as a listener, are listening to a piece being performed, that you always get a good sense of what sort of scale or what sort of tonality you're in. So you're listening to a piece, you'll get used to the scale and the harmony that it's in. And occasionally there will be some modulations, some deviations, but they always make sense in the overall context. What Debussy did, we'll hear quite a bit of that as well, is he had a lot of long passages that that don't seem to have any fundamental tonality at all. Or he would use different scales and different harmonies in different pieces. So it would seem like one piece of the orchestra was playing, for example, in C major, and the other piece would seem to play in, I don't know, G minor. That would not have been appreciated at something as prestigious as the Conservatory of Paris. So I can imagine his frustration, but I can also definitely imagine the frustrations of his teachers.
Yeah, I'd love to be doing his report card at the end of the term. But,
I'm amazed they didn't just kick him out at some point.
yeah. So, despite the fact that he wasn't a great student, but he did spend a lot of time at the conservatory, 11 years. And you can just imagine you go in there when you're 10, and he was going to be there till he was 21. So, lots of things happened to him along the way. And one of the interesting things was he got hired to teach piano in Moscow to the children of Nazda von Meck. And she's a fascinating character, and I think I'd like to write a book or do a screenplay about her someday. But just a quick overview of who she was. She was the rich widow of a guy named Karl Otto van Meck. He at first had this little government job. He wasn't doing very good, and she kept saying, you can do better, you can do better. And he decided to build railways. And anyways, long story short, he became a multimillionaire in Russia building railways, and they was doing very well. And all of a sudden, when she was about 45, he died. And she'd already had 11 children at that point. 7 were still living at home. And she was kind of a strange character. She was just more or less stayed in her house all the time. And she didn't even want to go to the weddings of her own children. But she loved to play the piano, and she loved classical music. And she became Tchaikovsky's patron. And next episode, we'll be doing Tchaikovsky. We'll probably talk a little bit more about her. It's a very strange relationship, which we can get into another time. But she decided she really liked to have piano music around the house, and she wanted somebody to tutor her daughters. So she found out about this guy, Claude Debussy, in Paris, and sent for him. And so he spent, I think, 2 or 3 summers with them, traveling. They went to France, Switzerland, Vienna, Italy, and back to Moscow. And he got introduced a bit to Tchaikovsky and actually transcribed some of his of Swan Lake into a piano duet, which he sent to Tchaikovsky, who didn't really think it was too great. And typical Debussy, and as we'll see, he had a very kind of odd personal life. He fell in love with one of Nazda's daughters and asked to marry her, but she said no. And so that was kind of the end of that. But that was typically his style. He liked to propose to women, didn't like staying married to them very much, but he certainly liked to fall in love with them. And I guess the next thing that happened was back at the conservatory, even though he was, and we've already talked about all the rules that he was breaking, he got entered into the Prix de Rome contest. And basically what that was it was a very difficult competition. It was started by the King of France at some point. And it was to find French artists, musicians and painters and sculptors and architects to help them get a scholarship to the French Academy in Rome, the Villa Medici. And they would spend up to 5 years there. And it was a very difficult competition to win. You had to go through a number of, in the music one, a number of competitions, and you could be eliminated. So Maurice Ravel tried 5 times and failed each time. And other composers tried it and failed, and some of them actually wanted to commit suicide after losing so many times. Debussy didn't have any problems and ended up winning it right off the bat. And even though people at the conservatory really were having doubts about him because he as we've talked about, just didn't follow any of the rules for composing. So he ended up spending 2 years in Rome, and but before he left there, he took a mistress, Marie Vasnier, and we'll talk a little bit about her later on. And didn't really like Rome at all. He hated everything. He didn't like the food. He didn't like the people. He didn't like the beds that they gave him to sleep in. Needless to say, he didn't do very much composing there. And the ones he did do, they hated it. They said it was bizarre, it was incomprehensible, and they just couldn't perform it. So that was his experience in Rome. And I guess, needless to say, he was happy to return to Paris when it was all done.
I can imagine that wouldn't be really motivating to hear from, by now, probably quite a few people who told him that.
Yeah. And one thing was he also listened to a lot of opera, which he didn't really like, Italian opera, but there is some older pieces that he did like. And I think you've got a little bit of background on that, Paul.
He didn't like church music, as it was kind of called back then. Again, because this was very according to form and structure. It wasn't really exciting. It wasn't really different. So it really bored him. But there were two composers, 15th, 16th century, who he actually did enjoy and was, as he called it, the only church music worth listening to at all. And that was Palestrina and Lassus. They were Italian composers. I've got a piece by Palestrina called Misso Accendo ad Pacem. I think you should have a listen to that. How could you not love that? At least personally, I love that. I think that's absolutely beautiful.
Can you imagine hearing that in a cathedral in Rome? That must have been.
I think that would be an amazing experience to hear this performed in a cathedral.
So after his experience in Rome, which, as we talked about, wasn't the greatest experience, I don't think, he came back to Paris, and he had some interesting kind of adventures. And one thing is he went to the World Exposition in 1889, which was quite the World Exposition, because that's when the world first got to see the Eiffel Tower. They were still working on it, and the night before they were up all night trying to get it ready so that people could actually walk on it without killing themselves, I guess. And there was also a big, gigantic exhibition called the Machine Hall. And it was the longest interior space that had ever been constructed up to that time. It was actually 20 acres of ground, if you can believe it. It was so big you could put 15,000 horses inside and have 15,000 people upstairs watching it. So it was a huge, huge building.
Are we talking real horses or ponies?
Real horses. Yeah, no ponies.
Wow.
Yeah.
Not just making sure.
Yeah. But it was so big, though, that it kind of sort of dominated. It was made out of iron and glass. And eventually, a few years later, they took it down because they wanted to open up that space, the Champ de Mars, because the Eiffel Tower is at one end. And if you've been to Paris, you kind of know that whole space is open. It's very beautiful. Mm-hmm. And the other interesting thing in that exhibition was there was pavilions from South America and everywhere else. And Buffalo Bill and Annie Oakley were there doing their Wild West show. So, and Debussy, I think, kind of mingled there and got inspired by lots of things that he's kind of saw and heard. Also around this time, he, for whatever reason, went to Germany every year to see the Wagner operas. And he really liked Wagner's music. He liked the sort of sensory nature of it, the way he mastered the form and the harmonies. But he kind of decided, he was not going to kind of follow in that footsteps and kind of almost, I wouldn't say do the opposite, but he saw that kind of music and he said it was a sunset, not a dawn. So I think it
Mm.
was very kind of telling of what his direction would be, is that he saw someone who actually he admired and enjoyed the form, but didn't see that as the future of the kind of music that he wanted to do.
Yeah, I can imagine that he wouldn't have been too happy with the German musical tradition. If you consider composers like Wagner, but also Bach and Beethoven, especially Bach was considered to be master of counterpoint, something that he, as a structure and theory, absolutely refused to follow.
Mm-hmm.
So the whole theoretical framework of music theory has a very strong origin in Germany. So I can imagine that he didn't really like that. He also, for example, the symphony form, which is one of the most, well, I'm not going to say popular, but it is in the classical world, it's very dominant. He considered that to be completely superfluous. It didn't, as far as he was concerned, it had no use anymore.
Yeah, interesting. And it's interesting that he studied this and appreciated it, but also knew this wasn't where he was going. So it's very instructive. And it's about this time, as a year later, that he wrote Clair de Lune, which we're going to talk about. But I guess it didn't actually, nobody knew about it for quite a few years. But I think this is probably a good time to talk about that piece.
So Clair de Lune is probably the most well-known piece by Claude Debussy. It's something you'll hear on TV, you'll hear it in movies, and we actually started the episode with it. And before I comment on the, let's say, the more musical aspect of it, I want to just play it again. So we're going to listen to Clair de Lune, the third movement of the Suite Bergamasque. So, Steve, I believe this is one of your favorite classical pieces.
I do really like that song, and I'm mad that we can't listen to the whole thing, but I'm sure people can go and listen to it on their own. But it's just about to explode just when you cut it off, I think. Um, and,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah, I enjoyed that song, and I think I heard it many years ago as a when I was much younger, and it just kind of stays with you. And every time you hear it, it's kind of sounds like it's the first time you've ever heard it. That's the way I feel about it.
Well, it is a very beautiful piece. And if you go online, if you search for it on Spotify or whatever on YouTube, you'll find a lot of different versions. And it's actually really well possible that every time you hear it, you'll hear it slightly different. And that is because he wrote it with a tempo indication that is tempo rubato. And that is a term that means that you, as a performer, are kind of allowed to speed up and slow down as you're performing as you see fit. So that allows you as a performer to give it a very strong personal interpretation.
So it was around this time that Debussy also composed his first arabesque, and there's some different theories as to what might have inspired him. One is that an arabesque is thought to be an ornamental design with intertwined flowing lines, which would make sense. But the one that's maybe more prevalent is that there's a move, a ballet, and a movement called the arabesque, and in that the dancer stands on one leg with the other leg turned out and extended way beyond her body. She keeps her arms perfectly straight, and it's a very kind of almost elegant but impossible looking geometry. And the arabesque, the word is an Islamic derivative, and it's in Islamic art, the only thing that's permitted are very kind of abstract decorative patterns and very geometric. And it's thinking that this would probably appeal to Debussy because there was this, on one hand, a kind of a uh, restriction to creativity, but it also lets you kind of imagine things that you can see through this kind of restriction. And so it's possible that just this ballet, the delicate nature of it and the rigidity of it, kind of inspired him. So that's where it possibly was his inspiration, although nobody knows for sure.
The arabesque actually has, especially the first one. Again, is a very well known piece. We'll listen to it in a moment. But before we do, I want to say something about one of the techniques that he uses in this. Again, he kind of shies away from a very firm tonality. He seems to wander through different keys and modes and very dreamlike quality to it, and it seems very elusive. Again, it's something that you can't quite grasp. And I want to play a small part of it, and then I want to go into one of the techniques that he uses in this. So this is the first arabesque by Claude Debussy. So a very typical sound, that waterfall of tones that just sort of seems to flow around you. And one of the techniques that he uses in this is something called it's very closely related to something called the faux bourdon. It literally means false bass. And it is a certain way of arranging the chords in a harmony to give it a little bit more of an interesting sound while at the same time creating typically a sort of monotonous quality to it. So what I did, I made a little example of that. So what you're going to hear now is the chords of the in the C major key following each other in the normal, what we call the root position. In the faux bourdon, all of them are actually put in what's called the first inversion. So if you normally have a C major chord, that would be C, E, G. And when you use the faux bourdon, you actually start with E, G, and then play the C. And because of the intervals which are involved in that, it creates a very different sound. So first we're going to hear the chords in their root position, and then it's going to be the same chords following each other, but they're all going to be in the first inversion with the faux bourdon effect.
So, as we've kind of discussed, Debussy was kind of a rule breaker musically and in his personal life as well. One of the reasons that people had issues with his personal life is that he was usually with one woman, having an affair with one woman while he was still with another. And we'll get into that in a little more detail later. But even with his music, there was people that had some issues with it. In terms of some of the reviews that came out, a critic in the French Daily Le Temps said of Lemaire, a piece that we're going to hear in a while, he says, "I do not hear it, I do not see, do not smell the sea." And one reviewer said of the prelude to the Afternoon of a Faun, the faun must have had a very bad day. And Tchaikovsky, who we talked about, who got a sneak peek at some of Debussy's work, said I guess it must have been really kind of the polar opposite to the kind of music that Tchaikovsky was doing, because he found it way too short. And he said there was not a single idea that was fully expressed. The form is shriveled up and it lacks unity. Ouch. That must have been kind of stinging to hear.
That hurts. Yeah.
But he was only 18 when Tchaikovsky, Debussy was 18 when he sent some of the stuff to Tchaikovsky. And that was the feedback he got, which is probably similar to a lot of the feedback he got back then.
Yeah, I think it must have been pretty hard for him to, express himself the way that he did and still get rejected by so many people and people that he looked up to. If you look at Prelude l'après-midi d'une faune, it is a beautiful piece, and it again, it's very well known by now. But back then, it was received. Some people loved it. Some people thought that the way that he used the orchestration also very much gave life to the atmosphere that was in the poem that sort of inspired it. For example, some people really loved how the woodwinds and the horns really created an impression of a warm forest, sound of nature, and the fact that he didn't use a lot of loud brass or percussion really added to the atmosphere. Again, we're sort of listening to a dream where a lot of different rhythms also come to pass, which again was not really that conventional at the time. So that was something that people wouldn't have enjoyed either. So Camille Saint-Saëns, for example, a very famous composer, also known for quite romantic and beautiful work, he said, this is as much music as the paint that is on the brush of a painter is a painting. So, a lot of people, they sort of said, we can hear the promise of it, but it just, it doesn't really work that well. Actually, the prelude was, I believe, also booed away by the jury in Paris.
Wow.
So let's listen to it for a moment, and aside from all the criticism, just enjoy it, because it is definitely a beautiful piece. So, without going into this particular piece too much, it does give a wonderful example of another technique that Debussy used, which was not very popular with composers at that time. And before I illustrate that, I want to give a little bit of background on it. Normally, in Western classical music, we use what is called the diatonic scale. And that means that in one scale, from C to C, we have two possible distances. We can have one semitone or two semitones. And if we look at the C major scale, it consists of a lot of what we call two semitone steps. And we have two parts in the major C scale that consists of one semitone step. What Debussy does is he uses what is called the whole tone scale. And he actually used that so much that they started calling it later the Debussy scale. I'm first gonna let you hear the normal diatonic scale and then the whole tone scale for a moment. I'll play that again in a moment, but I think you can probably hear a difference between the two, right, Steve?
Yeah. It seems like there's a higher range, I guess.
Well, it has it's still in the same range, but the thing is that it doesn't use any half steps.
Oh, okay.
And there is a bit of a problem with that, because first of all, it means that it has less tones in it than the normal scale. So the whole tone scale has one note less. It's called a hexatonic scale, whereas the normal diatonic scale involves 7 notes. And because it doesn't use any semitone steps, it also misses something really important, and that is what we call the leading tone. I'm going to play the I'm going to play the diatonic scale again. And when you listen towards the end, the last two notes, that is where it goes from B to C. The distance between that is only one semitone. And normally in classical music, the B always leads to C because it is, in this case, the leading tone of the key and the scale. So let's listen to that diatonic scale for a moment again. So that last bit, that last B to C, the leading tone, is very important. Unfortunately, the whole tone scale doesn't have a leading tone because the distance between every tone is two steps. That makes it really difficult as a listener to establish what kind of tonality we're dealing with. And we already know that Debussy, he didn't care about leading tones and counterpoint and harmony. So he used this a lot in his work.
But is that also why some people gravitated towards it and enjoyed it, because it just appealed to people differently than maybe what they were used to?
Yeah, absolutely. Because at the same time, that whole tone scale introduces a very different sort of harmony, a very different sound. The whole tone scale in itself has a very dreamlike quality. It's actually used a lot in film music when you're, for example, watching a fantasy movie or something like that, or a Disney movie. You will hear the whole tone scale a lot because of its dreamy quality. So there is a lot to be said for it. But again, at the time that Debussy was composing these pieces and bringing them to the audience, a lot of people would not have liked it because it was against convention. It was not what they're used to. They couldn't get a grip on the piece.
Claude Debussy had a very interesting personal life. He probably wasn't the most likable guy in the world, and he had many. The trouble is, he would be with one woman and kind of deciding to go with the next one, but he didn't really leave the first one properly. So that got him into a fair bit of trouble, as you can expect.
Yeah, I can imagine that. Yeah, it wouldn't be appreciated.
Yeah. So we talked about how he, when he was hanging out in Moscow with Nazda von Meck, he wanted to marry one of her daughters. Then the second big romantic interlude was when he came back from Paris after being in Rome for a while. He played piano in a singing class at the conservatory, and there was a singer, Marie Vasnier, which was fine, except she was already married to Henry Vasnier. She thought Claude was great, and they became lovers. Marie was his mistress for 7 years. But the interesting part was her husband was okay with it, which was maybe that's a French thing, you know?
Oh, well, it's, if they're happy, it works.
Sure. So, but this was about the time, this is just before he went to Rome. And so while he was in Rome and he wasn't very happy, he would come back to see Marie and maybe have lunch with her husband. I don't know. So that went on for about 7 years. But when he finally did come back and he was back in Paris, she said, well, she had enough. So she kind of dumped him. So the next sort of event in his life was Gabrielle Dupont. She was, this was when he was about 30. So they started living together. And basically, as soon as they started living together, he started having an affair with somebody else, Therese Roger. And the other thing, I guess, is he liked to borrow money, but he didn't really like to pay it back. So he would borrow money from his friends and from his relatives. And for some reason, he thought, I'm an artist, I don't need to pay the money back. And so I don't think that endeared him. And so when he started living with Gabrielle, he also started having an affair with somebody else, Therese Roger. And at that point, a lot of his friends sort of had enough. Basically, they disowned him at that point. So that was just sort of the beginning, I think, of his his reputation. So he's living with Gabrielle. He has an affair with Therese and decides to propose to her. His friends were really outraged because he's living still with Gabrielle. He proposes to somebody else. So he goes back to her, but then she has a friend, Marie Rosalie, who is called Lily. So again, he's still living with Gabrielle. He proposes to Lily, and he said that if he didn't, if she said no, he was going to commit suicide. So I think he's a very dramatic kind of guy, to put
Sounds
it mildly.
like fun at parties.
Yeah, exactly. So they got married, but she wasn't too wild about his music, and I think that made him very unhappy. So he was tutoring another student, and she had a mother, Emma Bardak, and Emma liked to hang out with French composers. That was her thing. So her and Claude soon kind of hooked up. But he's still married to Lily at this point, and she was off planning their fifth wedding anniversary. So he said, "Why don't you go to your parents' house, get everything ready?" And meanwhile, he took off with Emma out to the country, traveling kind of in disguise. And he told Lily that the marriage was over. Didn't say anything about Emma or had a mistress. So when Emma when Lily figured it out, it was just before their fifth wedding anniversary. She took out a revolver and tried to shoot herself, but she didn't quite succeed, and she survived. And the bullet actually stayed lodged in her for the rest of her life. But this really put the remaining friends that he had sort of over the top, and it was really difficult for him. So he took his mistress, I guess, Emma, to England. It wasn't long after that she got pregnant, and eventually they got married. So it was just a quick summary of his. He was composing music and doing everything else at the same time, but this was kind of in the background for him. So while he was in England, kind of hiding out from all the people that he sort of ticked off in Paris, including his current wife, Lily, he spent time with Emma, his new mistress, eventually to be wife, and she was pregnant. What he was working on was finishing up the final transcript and things for La Mer. He'd come back in the fall to debut that, and I think, Paul, you're going to play a little bit of that for us.
Yeah, I am. Before I do that, I just want to give a bit of an overview on the piece. Again, it is a beautiful piece, but again, in that period of time, it would have had a very mixed reception, and it did for those who were a little bit more open to the, let's say, new elements that the style of Debussy brought to music at that time. It was a wonderful piece, but everyone who was more used and had a little bit more preference for the conventional ways of composition and writing, it was, well, they kind of hated it. They didn't understand it. It used a lot of tempo changes, a lot of dynamic changes, sudden explosions that really weren't common. So again, it had very mixed reviews, like unfortunately most of his work until that point. One of the earlier performances was conducted by a man called Camille Chavillard. Apparently, during rehearsals, Debussy was actually completely confused and annoyed because the conductor didn't seem to understand the work and found that the conductor lacked in artistry. But that would be, kind of explainable because the conductor would be used to a lot more conventional pieces and not I think impressionistic is a term that would be suitable here, even though Claude hated being called that. But there's a good reason why people do call it that.
It's easy to imagine him, given his sort of personality, listening to the rehearsals and having a hard time if it's not going exactly the way he thinks it should be performed and played.
Yeah, it would be very difficult for the conductor and the orchestra as well, because as we talked about a little bit earlier, one of the things that Debussy did, for example, was sort of avoid the idea of tonality, which normally in Western classical music, especially in the common practice period before that, that is a very important element to, to sort of establish where we are and what key are we in, what can we expect. And because Claude's work didn't really have that, it would be quite difficult for a conductor to properly work with that, especially when the composer himself is sitting next to it, probably look at him like he's an idiot.
Yeah, exactly.
So I can imagine that wouldn't be that much fun rehearsing. He did actually conduct it himself at some point, and that was quite a successful attempt. But again, critics were still very divided, especially the more old-fashioned music critics. But the audience loved it. So we're going to listen to the opening of La Mer by Claude Debussy. just listening to that, what kind of description and experience comes to mind for you, Steve, when you listen to
Yeah,
that?
well, when I listen to that, I think of like tone poetry, or it's almost, at first I was thinking like a film soundtrack. I'm thinking pictures and things
Mm.
like that. But as I'm listening to a little bit more, it's kind of like poetry in motion or something. It's just painting pictures, I think, is the way I feel about it.
Yeah, and I think that's why a lot of people refer to his work as musical impressionism. He does that a lot in not only in Lemaire but quite a few other pieces as well. He's able to create an atmosphere that is very enchanting, very surprising. It also really seems to sort of simulate the setting that he is working in. I mean, Lemaire, of course, means the sea. It definitely, I'm definitely reminded of the sea, or I can imagine the sea when I'm listening to this. When we listen to the Prélude de l'après-midi d'une faune, the warm woodwinds and the whole setting creates that atmosphere of a warm summer afternoon. That is very typical of Debussy and very wonderful to listen to. Again, when I to it from a theory point of view, and I listen to the opening of La Mer, all I can think is, you might want to decide on a key and actually give us as a listeners, some sort of
Yeah.
anchor to know where the heck are we? Where are we going? And then suddenly other instruments and other parts are introduced that once again, when there is even a hint of tonality, you're taken away from it again by, for example, the woodwinds that come in and accentuate
Yeah.
something completely different. Especially when you think about the music critics who were not very happy with this work. I can really understand why.
But also, as you said, the audience loved it, and they don't care about which key it's in and things like that. They just care about the overall feeling that they have. Whereas a music critic is, I think, approaching it very differently.
Yeah, and I also know that there were a few music critics who absolutely loved it. So it was not that all the critics hated it and all the public loved
Hmm.
it. Yeah, definitely the audience when he conducted it himself, they absolutely, they were blown away because he was able
Yeah.
to lead the orchestra through the piece in a way that he knew that it had to be done. That must
Hmm.
have been quite an impressive performance.
Yeah, I can imagine. So it's interesting. The same month that was debuted, his only child was born, Claude Emma, named, I guess, after her father and her mother, Claude and Emma. Her nickname was Choo Choo, and he did actually end up writing a little piece for her, The Children's Corner, which was a very kind of sweet piece. And apparently, he was still very distraught though about the attempted suicide by his first wife, Lily. Unfortunately, Claude Emma did. She didn't survive. Well, she died at 14, just about a year after Claude died, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. But that was the one person I think he did feel close to in his life. I don't know about the women in his life, because when you read about it, he was very infatuated at first, but then he would always find reasons why it just wasn't kind of a long-term thing. But with his daughter, he did a very special, sweet affection for her.
The more we talk about him, I get the impression that he was probably a very impulsive person.
Yes, and I think he was haunted by a lot of things. He was kind of like a restless nature, and
Mhm.
saw himself as an artist that was a little bit above people, which I think made him kind of distant, because
Mm.
I think even with his relationships with women, music was more important than the relationship, even though he got very infatuated and things, but he also got depressed quickly. And, he's probably like the classic artist suffering
Yeah.
artist, I think, is
Yeah, definitely
overall. But
the tortured soul.
yeah, but fortunately his music doesn't strike you that way completely when you listen to it. It's almost like the soothing balm that he needed to kind of get through things.
So, a few years after the debut of La Mer, Claude published quite a few other works, and most of them were piano works, which is not surprising as he was an amazing pianist, and it was definitely his instrument of choice. He published some books on preludes. So, the first book included a piece which I really like myself. It was called La Cathédrale Engloutie, which means the engulfed cathedral. I've always really liked that title, and I'm really curious. And I believe Steve can give us a little bit of background of that, where it comes from. But the image of the cathedral submerged underwater, especially when we hear the music, which really gives
Hmm.
that impression, has always spoken to me.
Yeah, yeah. It's based on a Breton myth about a cathedral which is underwater off the coast of the island of Ys. which rises up from the ocean, and you could see it on a clear morning when the water's very clear. And Breton, it's a variation of the Celtic language from the British Isles, but it was actually spoken in France in the Brittany region, which is on the west coast. Ys is a mythical city, so it translates as a low city. It was swallowed by the ocean. Of course, this is all myth and lore, but it's a story that was around for hundreds of years. And there was a king there, King Gradlon, and his daughter apparently really liked the sea. So he built a dike, and I guess being in the Netherlands, you'd appreciate this, to prevent it from flooding. But the only thing is, there was only one key that would open the dike to let the water in or to control it, and the king is the one that had the key. But his daughter met some guy, a bit like Mr. Debussy, and so she stole the key because she was trying to meet this guy, her lover. And of course, the ocean poured in and killed everybody in the whole city except for the king. And the daughter, Dahoud, became a mermaid, and she apparently still kind of out there haunting people. And so people say that you can hear sort of the remnants of the city and the priests and bells and organs and all this kind of stuff from this sort of tragic story of the city that was swallowed up by the sea. So that's kind of the myth that goes behind the story. And I think from what I've heard, Debussy is trying to recreate, again, another sound poem to, put the soundtrack to this story together.
Yeah, well, we're going to listen to that. I think with the background that we have now, it definitely paints a bit of a different picture for me, but it's still, very much that musical picture that Claude was so good at. So without any further ado, here is La Cathédrale Engloutie. So again, with most of the other Debussy pieces that we've heard so far, there doesn't really seem to be an anchor in the piece that informs us, this is the key that we're playing in, this is the harmony that you might be expecting, which was a bit more usual in that time. But it definitely creates that impressive atmosphere. It kind of uses the piano, as a paintbrush to paint a very impressionistic musical picture, at least to me.
Is that only on the piano, that piece?
Yeah, both of the books were piano works.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah, it's amazing what you can, the evocative images you get out of just the one instrument. So one of the interesting things about Debussy is the period that he lived in. The last part of the 19th century, France is in very much upheaval. There was 60 different governments, as we said, in the span of his lifetime. And then World War I started. Around that time, he discovered he had colon cancer. And obviously, that's a pretty serious ailment. And he had one of the earliest colostomy operations ever performed. And it was only sort of partially successful. And a few years later, he died. And a year or so after that, his only daughter, Claude Emma, that we talked about, died as well. So it wasn't, as a lot of these composers we've seen, the mid-50s seems to be when things catch up to them, various illnesses and things, which, back then, that's a lot of people. They didn't have the same kind of medicine and science we have nowadays. So kind of a tragic ending. But he was, at the time of his death, he'd become kind of almost a national hero in France. It took a while, but that was, from a historic perspective, I think that was his legacy in France.
Yeah, I think his legacy definitely extends beyond France. I think most people listening will definitely know most of the piece that we play today, Claire de Lune. It's very popular. It still speaks to a lot of people these days. I think Debussy has left an enormous imprint on musical history, by daring to break the conventions in which they kind of wanted to force him to work within. He also inspired, especially the poly and the bitonality, which he is very famous for, that lack of tonality, that working within several settings and keys at the same time, at first may have not been popular with a lot of people, but later it got a lot of followers. First of all, Bela Bartok, but another one was definitely Igor Stravinsky. And he even went a little bit further when when his piece, The Rite of Spring, was played for the very first time, which is also very polytonal. It's worse is not a really good term, but I'm going to use it anyway. It's a lot worse than the music that Debussy presented to the audience because it went even a lot further. And again, half of the audience in the concert hall really wanted to listen where Stravinsky was taking this. And the other half of the audience almost literally tore down the concert hall. There was actually
Really?
there was a small revolt in the concert hall because people, they felt assaulted on their senses. They felt insulted by the music that he was putting forth. So it takes a certain kind of audience. And I can imagine that a lot of people might definitely like, for example, Claire de Lune, which sounds quite accessible when you look at the portfolio from Debussy, but may not, for example, enjoy the Engulf Cathedral or La Mer. It's in the end, it's also always personal taste.
Do you see Debussy as kind of the end of music from that era and the kind of opening up of the 20th century for composers?
Yeah, that period of time is definitely marked, is definitely a transition between what we call the common practice period, which lasted about, just top of my head, about 1600 to early 1900s. And Debussy is definitely one of those composers that started breaking the old traditions, moved away from conventional harmony, counterpoint, orchestration, and tried to do something completely different.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. I think the things that he always used to say was that he had to be who he was. He couldn't be anybody else, which, makes sense for most people. So he was always, I think, trying to be true to the voices that were inside of him, which must have been difficult because, he was not always universally loved, or he had as many critics as admirers. And I guess we're all very thankful that he did persist.
So I think that brings us to the end of this particular episode about Claude Debussy. I believe we're going to do one more podcast before the end of the year, Steve, and we already picked someone for that.
Mr.
And
Tchaikovsky.
Indeed, Pyotr Ilyich Tchaikovsky, the Russian composer, very famous one. I think everyone has heard the name. He was one of the greatest composers of what is called the High Romantic period. He was a composer. He also taught at the Conservatory of St. Petersburg. I actually have a book by his hand called the Guide to the Practical Study of Harmony, and he wrote it during his tenure at St. Petersburg Conservatory. He's famous for a lot of things. I suspect that people will have heard of Swan Lake, the Nutcracker, the Overture 1812. But there are so many more wonderful, amazing pieces that he wrote, which are very typical, a very lush, romantic sound, very warm and rich orchestration, an incredible imagination when it came to the use of melodies. Funnily enough, and we'll definitely be talking about that as well, his fellow Russian composers, at least a few famous one of those days, didn't really like his work. There was a small group of Russian composers back then called the Hope of Five. Not sure if that's the correct translation. We'll see that in the next podcast. But that included composers like Balakirev and Rimsky-Korsakov. They considered his work to be too Western. They didn't like it. So it's interesting. It's going to be interesting to see why that is and how that worked out for him during his life.
Yeah. And Tchaikovsky did have some minor association with Debussy and also with with Edward Grieg, who we talked about last episode. So they're all kind of in that same time period, and I think they did have some connections with each other. So yeah, we'll look at all of that.
Cool.
Thank you for listening to Musical Footprints. Please sure to visit our website, musicalfootprints.com, for show notes, and there's a list of all the music pieces that we played, plus links to many different Debussy music resources and that kind of thing. So I just put together a very long list of resources on Debussy, so have a look at the website. This is Steve Moretti. Thanks for listening.
Until next time, this is Paul van Geldrop signing off with the music of Claude Debussy.